Hey everyone, I thought today we would sit down and have a lovely, cozy book chat. I haven't really been sharing what I've been reading too much on my channel recently, so I wanted to go over the books that I read in January and February. I completed a total of 23 books in the first 2 months of this year, and I have about 5 or 6 ongoing books that I'm currently working through that I'll just have to share those in a later video, maybe at the end of March or April. So let's get right into it. The first book I read this year was Emily Climbs by Anne Montgomery. This was the second book in the Emily series by Montgomery. If you haven't heard of the series, I'm sure you've heard of the Anne of Green Gables series by Montgomery, which is her more popular series, but honestly, Emily deserves just as much attention and love as the Anne series does, in my opinion. And Emily is different from Anne in some really critical ways. First of all, she is a dedicated writer in a way that Anne never was. So if you love Jo March, if you see Jo March from Little Women as the perfect kind of literary heroine, the writer, the lover of books, you'll love Emily Starr because she is very similar to Jo. She's a born writer. She has great ambitions for literary success. She's similar to Anne in the way that she is an orphan who moves in with her older, very traditional relatives and kind of needs to struggle to adjust to life in this beautiful house on Prince Edward Island in this farm. She needs to settle into that while also trying to pursue her non-traditional dreams of being a professional writer. Yeah, so all in all, Emily Climbs is just a very sweet coming-of-age story. Emily experiences many of the challenges of growing up that we all do. There's also a very sweet kind of love story throughout the 3 books in the Emily series with Emily's childhood friend who is a visual artist, so like a painter. Yeah, and then the second book that I read was Emily's Quest, which is the 3rd book in the series. First book is Emily of New Moon, second Emily Climbs, third Emily's Quest. And in Emily's Quest, we actually see Emily start to achieve literary success and get some of her works published. But the question is, at what cost? And meanwhile, the boy that she loves is off in Montreal and then around the world studying art. And there's that tension of they're both kind of 2 artists chasing their dreams, but how are they going to fit into each other's lives? They're childhood friends, but can they be more than friends? Because both of them feel that in their heart for each other, but actually getting there is definitely a challenge. Thing about the Emily series, I literally couldn't put this down. I read all 3 books in like a few weeks, and I just felt like a hole in my heart was being filled a little bit. I had the same feeling that I feel when I read about Jo March and Little Women. These characters' spunkiness, ambition, determination, their big dreams, and the way that they pursue them are just so inspiring. And yeah, I honestly ached when the series was over. I was just like, no. It filled a hole in my heart, and now that hole is going to open again once I'm not reading this book, and I can never reread it for the first time again and experience that joy and excitement about this character, Emily Starr. Okay, moving on. The 3rd book that I read this year was Little Men by Louisa May Alcott. I reread Little Women frequently every year, at least once, if not twice. So I figured it was maybe time to branch into some of Alcott's other works, and Little Men seemed like a good place to start, and it was. It had all of kind of the same charms as Little Women did. A tight-knit family, all the ups and downs of childhood, and the dynamic of a full household with spirited, independent individuals within that household. That's all in Little Men as well. I really love to see Jo and her husband, Fritz Bauer Bear, managing this house full of boys and teaching them, leading them in virtue, but also nourishing their minds, teaching them intellectually. Yeah, and boys are boys. Boys do funny things, they have crazy adventures, they get into fights, and all that is in this book. It's also cool just to get glimpses into the futures of the characters from the March family that you fall in love with when you read Little Women. So you get to see Laurie and Amy and their little baby again. You get to see Meg and John and their brood of kids again and how their life together goes. You get to meet Marmee and Father again. Most importantly to me is to see Jo kind of as a mature woman who's learned many lessons through her own character flaws, for better or for worse, and through her own lifelong struggles. It's cool to see her be able to guide little hearts wisely and with love. I love that. So overall, I really enjoyed Little Men. I still prefer Little Women, and that's never gonna change. But if you liked Little Women, then I'm sure you will like Little Men as well, so I do recommend it. The fourth book that I read was Rembrandt is in the Wind, Learning to Love Art Through the Eyes of Faith by Russ Ramsey. And I have talked about this book already on my channel, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but this was an exploration of, I forget if it was 9 or 11 incredible artists and the challenges that they overcame throughout their life. Yeah, this book gave fascinating insights into art history if you're interested in Michelangelo, Van Gogh, and others. And it also really digs deeper into the meaning of art. So why do we pursue beauty? What is beauty? Also the question of what even is art? What is its purpose? So if you're a lover of beauty, if you're an artist, I highly recommend this book. I think you'll get a lot out of it. I actually don't have it with me because I lent it to my friend who is an artist. But yes, do check out some of my previous videos. I'll leave a link if I can find which video it was that I talk more about this book, if you're interested. The fifth book that I read this year was Remaking the World, How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West by Andrew L. Wilson. This is an excellent history book that examined the intellectual, political, economic, industrial, scientific development since 1776, kind of exploring the question, how did the modern world lose God? I have also talked at length about this in a previous video, which I will link here. The sixth book I read this year was The Republic by Plato. Not an easy read. Yeah, pretty dense philosophy. The Republic is basically this conversation between Socrates and some students, some young men in Athens about, well, all kinds of topics, but mainly about justice and what a state should look like, what a government should look like, how the government should be run, who should be in charge. Yeah, Socrates is trying to guide his students towards answers to all those questions. I recommend that everyone read Plato at some point. Socrates never wrote down anything. He never wrote his own books. What we know about Socrates and his philosophy comes through his students who transcribed a lot of what he said, and this is the classic example. Plato writing down things that Socrates said, supposedly. And I am a pretty big fan of a lot of the concepts that come through in the Republic, such as, yeah, the idea of the philosopher king, that people in charge of the state should be well-versed in philosophy, should be deep thinkers, and should comprehend the forms, so kind of the ultimate realities of things. You can find the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic, where he talks about the different forms, and the form of the good is most critical to his argument about politics, and the philosopher king should be able to comprehend the good, because if they do, they will rule rightly and in accordance with the good. Yeah, I'm gonna leave that there because Plato and Socrates are kind of too complex and too deep for me to explain in just a few minutes here, so I would just recommend that you go and read the book for yourself. The seventh book that I read was Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, and I have talked about this one a little bit in previous videos. I struggled with this one, to be honest. Not that it wasn't well written, not that it wasn't a gripping plot, not that the characters weren't interesting, they were. It is a good book in that sense. It is great literature. But yeah, I mean, it's the story of this woman who just can't find satisfaction in anything in life, even the extramarital love affairs that she throws herself into, which these affairs are kind of what drive the plot of the book. She gets married, gets really bored of her husband, who is actually a really good person. Yes, he's dull and uninteresting and not very successful in a worldly sense, but he's still a good person. He still loves her and takes good care of her. But she's just had it with him, and she has these affairs with all these other men, and nothing satisfies her. She is an incredibly kind of selfish and desperate woman. She does not look out for her child or for anyone else for that matter. She's just pursuing her own pleasure and this vision of happiness that she has that only ever proves to be fleeting and immaterial, and she can never hold on to it. Any good feelings, any feelings of love and satisfaction and hope, she can't hold on to them. In the end, she destroys her life. She destroys her husband's life. She hurts many other people. Yeah, I think this book is all quite ironic. Flaubert is not saying that, is not glorifying adultery, but yes, this book is full of adultery and extramarital affairs, and I didn't love reading about them, even though I can understand the message behind it, and I can understand that Gustave is trying to make a point about finding contentment and satisfaction in your circumstances and not believing that the grass is always greener, because it's not. If you follow your heart, it's probably not going to lead you to good places. I don't know, I do need to think and reflect on this one a little bit more, but I have very mixed feelings about it. I'll leave it at that. The 8th book that I read was Once There Was a Bear, Tales of Before It All Began by Jane Riordan. This is just a sweet little story of how Christopher Robin came to have all his little beloved teddy bears and all the characters in the Pooh Bear series. Pooh, Piglet, Eeyore, Tigger. The book was full of delightful illustrations. This is basically a bedtime story. It was just soft and sweet and simple and comforting and nostalgic, and I really enjoyed reading it. I think I read it in one sitting. It didn't take me very long. A good children's storybook that can give joy to your adult heart. The 9th book that I read was The Blue Castle by Ellen Montgomery, and I've also spoken about this one in a previous video. This is one of Montgomery's adult novels. It's different from the Anne and the Emily series. It's not set in Prince Edward Island. It's set in Ontario. It's very short and snappy and surprisingly delightful. Like, it's honestly one of my favorite Montgomery books, and I was not expecting that at all. I don't know what I was expecting, but not to fall so deeply in love with this story. It's hilarious. It's probably her funniest book. I just found myself chuckling and smiling like over and over as I read through it. It's got a very relatable heroine and a very unique and kind of surprising love story. Yeah, you definitely don't see certain things coming, and when they happen, you're like, what? But in a really good way. So by way of a spoiler, just to show you how unique it really is, this girl Valancy, who is extremely dull and her life sucks because her mother controls her and her mother's a terrible person and she basically has no fun. She's the butt of everyone's joke. Her life is very, very sad. You feel very sorry for her. She finds out that she has less than a year to live, and so she marries the town outlaw, like this guy who's rumored to have done all sorts of bad things, and he's a total bad boy, no respect for kind of the norms and the traditions of the town and the norms and traditions of her family especially, so of course it infuriates her mother and extended family. But it's hilarious how it all turns out, because he turns out to be someone no one expected, and my, how the tables turn. Anyway, I will leave it at that, but do read The Blue Castle by Montgomery because it is amazing. The 10th book that I read was The Poetics by Aristotle, a philosophy book, but for the lover of literature, I'd say, of classical literature especially. Aristotle he breaks down literary forms. He talks a lot about comedy, tragedy, and their parts. What makes comedy a comedy, what makes a tragedy, which is superior. Kind of compares that to the epics. Yeah, it just talks a lot about different genres and forms of literature. Very categorical, as Aristotle is, just breaking everything down, categorizing everything. Yeah, it wasn't my favorite to read, but it also wasn't too hard to understand. Yeah, it's always just satisfying when you can read Aristotle and walk away knowing some things and understanding his mind and the way that he thinks about things instead of just being flabbergasted. So The Poetics is a good place to start, maybe, if you want to read more classical philosophy, because it is a very short book and it's dealing with literature and its forms, which is not so abstract. Like Aristotle talks about how catharsis, the release of emotions, is like the point of tragedy. It's supposed to make the audience feel things and just release that tension of feeling. That concept, which you may have heard of if you studied literature just in general, that comes from Aristotle in The Poetics, so that's cool. The 11th book that I read this year was The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. It's the incredible true story of the resistance of one family in Nazi-occupied Holland. Not just of one family, like the resistance, the Dutch resistance against the German occupiers. It's a story about the faith and the resilience of this Christian family and their dedication to hiding Jews and fanning opposition to the Nazis. This is a story that sits with you for a very long time. The 12th book I read was another Ellen Montgomery book. I know, I'm crazy about her. Mistress Pat. Yeah, it was fantastic. I wasn't sure about it at first, but I'm really glad that I didn't give up on this book because it was amazing. It has all the hallmarks of a good Montgomery book: country homes, deep family attachments and lore, growing pains, you could say, sweet love stories, all the things. And it really gets at the question of what is a home? What is a home? What is a home worth? Is home really a place? As storied and memoried as that place may be, do you need that place to be at home, or is it the people who filled it and the moments that were lived in it, which you cannot hold on to those moments forever because they are the past? Yeah, it just deals with these questions and these themes, and I really, really enjoyed that because I also get deeply, deeply attached to places, and so it was cool to see Mistress Pat work through that. The 13th book that I read this year was The Song of Roland by an unknown author. This is a medieval French chivalric ballad in which Charlemagne and his noble Christian knights wage war against the Muslim king of Spain and his allies. Yeah, it wasn't bad. It was easy enough to read and follow the story, but it was very historically inaccurate. It was a little bit derogatory at times as well towards the non-Christians, which is never good, but again, it's a product of the Middle Ages. Yeah, let's leave it at that. This is very much a product of the Middle Ages. 14th book that I read was Leonardo da Vinci by Walter Isaacson, and I made a whole video on this book. Yeah, it's just an excellent biography of one of the world's greatest geniuses. It's chock full of images, charts, diagrams, and all the visuals that are necessary to truly appreciate Leonardo's skill and brilliance as an artist, scientist, etc. The 16th book that I've read is The Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. Again, another Aristotle text, which was by no means an easy read, but it was rewarding and satisfying to work through it slowly. Yeah, overall it was actually pretty interesting. In this book you get the concept of eudaimonia, or happiness and felicity, which Aristotle believed was the ultimate end of all things. So he believed that human life is teleological, that it has an end, a goal, and a purpose, and ultimately he says that end is eudaimonia. Even if you think your chief goal in life, or you're living as if your chief goal in life is pleasure or honor, both of those are kind of rooted in eudaimonia. Like, eudaimonia is behind them. Happiness and felicity are achieved through pleasure, through honor, through whatever. This book talks a lot about virtue because virtue is directly connected to eudaimonia. You won't experience it if you're not a virtuous person. Being virtuous accentuates your experience of these good things in life. Aristotle talks a lot about the golden mean of virtue, avoiding extremes. For example, having too much pride makes you really haughty and toxic because you're a narcissist, but having not enough means you have no sense of self-esteem and you can't really function well either, so you need to be somewhere in the middle. Aristotle expands on this concept by digging into 12 core virtues, which are famously Aristotle's 12 virtues, and I'm not going to name them now. And this book also has some great discussions on friendship and what it means to be a friend and to have a friend and what that should look like. The 17th book that I read this year was Winning His Spurs by G.A. Henty. This was just a very fast-paced, fun, kind of very old-school work of historical fiction. It follows a young Saxon boy as he heads out on the Third Crusade under Richard the Lionheart, King of England. And there is just an impossible amount of unexpected adventures along the way. Like, it was crazy how fast things moved and how much happened within this relatively short little novel. Yeah, Henty doesn't waste space, dwelling on people's feelings or impressions of things. It's just like action, 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 moving from place to place to place. Yeah, not the most dynamic book necessarily. Yeah, I find that characters in Henty novels are always very flat. The good guys are just good, full stop, and the bad guys are bad, full stop. The hero is just perfect. He never messes up, and he always says the right thing and does the right thing and wins all these honors, and you're just kind of like, okay, I guess this is a good model of virtue and like we should strive to be like our hero, but also he seems a little bit unattainable and isn't that relatable. Yeah, that's kind of the tension that I found in this book and in the other Henty novels that I've read. But I still do recommend it, especially I think for teenage boys. And I mean, I read it with my grade 8 students and they loved it. So, book number 18 was Paradise Lost by John Milton. This book was beyond incredible. It wasn't the easiest to read. I honestly found reading the Odyssey and the Iliad easier most of the time. And this book is also chock full of classical allusions. And so if you get them, you get them. And if you don't, you're kind of like, okay. That whole page didn't make any sense to me. All that being said, this is probably the most worthy, epic poem that I've ever read. I think it profoundly communicates truth about the human condition, about who God is, and about mankind's need for God. And it's very, very theological, and a lot of it probably won't make sense to you if you're not a Christian or you don't have a Christian background and an understanding of Christian concepts. As a Christian, reading through it was very enlightening. Everything about it kind of made sense to me. Yeah, it really digs deep into the depths of the depravity of the devils, failure of man to resist, the temptation to be like God as Satan promises them, the marvelous grace of God, the voluntary heart of his Son to redeem and restore man into a right relationship with God after man's fall. Paradise Lost is hugely spiritually significant, and it was a spiritual journey for me to go through it. And so I highly recommend it to Christians especially, but to non-Christians too if you're interested interested in maybe understanding these concepts of creation and the fall and redemption and who Jesus is and what he does for mankind, if you're interested, then I highly recommend Paradise Lost. Of course, I'd recommend reading the Bible before Paradise Lost if you're interested in Christianity and learning about the teachings of Christianity, but I think both go hand in hand quite well, although perhaps reading Paradise Lost does require some level of discernment on the part of the Christian and actually thinking through, does this actually line up with the Bible and what the Bible teaches? I found that it did for the most part. Yeah, that's why I just felt so kind of encouraged and invigorated by it. Okay, the 19th book that I read was Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. It was very delightful. Very like other Jane Austen novels. They're all alike, but this one was also unlike some of the other Jane Austen novels in some key ways. I really enjoyed the character of Fanny Price. She's this kind of comparatively ill-born young girl. She gets to spend some time with her relatives at Mansfield Park, her really wealthy relatives, and she develops impeccably good manners, better than the rest of them, to be honest. She's a very virtuous, principled woman who always does the right thing. She's very wise for her age. She refuses to lower her standards for anyone, even for the opportunity to marry someone rich. And so yeah, I admire her. I think she's cool. She's dedicated to bettering herself, to learning, to reading. She sticks to her principles. She doesn't compromise in what she believes. She has a heart of love and compassion to those around her, but she's also not a pushover. She doesn't give in to society's pressures, the peer pressure of her own family members. And yeah, I think there's a lot to admire about Fanny Price. If you love Jane Austen and her novels, you will love Mansfield Park, so I highly recommend it. 20th book I read was Knowing God by J.I. Packer. This book just delves into who the God of the Bible really is versus who we sort of construe him to be or who we maybe want him to be. It's important to know God because knowing God helps us know ourselves and our purpose. This book was very theologically deep and again, a very, very Christian book that really gets into the weeds of Christian teaching and Christian belief about God based on scripture, based on the Bible. It was a joy to read this with my students. Actually, it sparked a lot of great conversations and debate. If you're a Christian and you want to kind of refresh and solidify your understanding of who God is, this is a great book for you. Or if you have no idea who the Christian God is whatsoever and you want to know and you're kind of theologically and philosophically minded or capable, then this is a book for you. But again, I would say start with the Bible. And this isn't necessarily an easy read either. 21st book that I read was The Secret History by Donna Tartt, and I also talked about this one a few videos ago, so I won't spend too much time here, but this is a book that I return to again and again, time and time again, for its kind of atmospheric, dark academia setting, its classical illusions. The characters are really, really intriguing, and honestly, they haunt me. I can never forget about them. I think about Charles and Camilla, and Richard and Edmund and Henry and Francis all the time. There's something about like an elite group of students at a New England college who get their hands on secret knowledge, in this case knowledge of the Bacchic ritual and kind of this Greek occult stuff. There's something about that that's really fascinating and intriguing. The group dynamic is fascinating, how things kind of work between these 6 characters and their friendships. That's probably the best part, is honestly just watching the relationships change and seeing the dynamics between the 6 of them, especially as the narrator Richard Papin comes from the outside and kind of enters into this group. How does he fit in? How could he infiltrate the group and become one of them? Yeah, I mean, it's a very dark book. You know, there's a lot of murder and alcohol and sex and suicide, but underneath it is, I think, the message that beauty without morality is terror. It's grotesque madness, and beauty and morality must go hand in hand, and these Greek students try to separate them, and it doesn't work, and it destroys their lives. And ultimately, I do think that, yeah, the message or the ethic that Donna Tartt is trying to promote is fundamentally good, but again, every time I read this book, I come away with something new. I'm left just thinking and stewing over, okay, what does this mean? What does she mean? How am I supposed to think about this? Is this actually a good book and something I should be reading? That's just something that I need to work through time and time again. And I imagine many of you have maybe had a similar kind of struggle or approach to this book where you feel shamefully compelled to some of the darkness in here, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And yeah, it's good writing, it's good literature, and the point of this book, I think, is well worth it. Okay, we're almost there, I promise. My 22nd book is Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. It's very like Mansfield Park. You have this virtuous, strong-willed, principled, hardworking, independent-minded heroine who sees through the foolish coquetry of kind of upper class society. Agnes Grey is the daughter of a curate, not very high-born, not wealthy. She chronicles her experiences as a governess of first willful little children and later the most infuriatingly rich little flirt, horrible woman girl. But all the time, Agnes is kind of this paragon of virtue. She does so much good in a number of lives, and it often feels like her goodness and her work is not rewarded and is pointless. But ultimately, it's not, and it's cool to see her persevere through that. Even when she can't enjoy the fruits of her labor, she just does what's right, she keeps working at it, she doesn't give up. This is a pretty short book, and I haven't read any Anne Bronte up to this point. I've read Charlotte and Emily, but not Anne, and so I quite enjoyed this book overall. I mean, it wasn't anything mind-blowing, but it was a sweet and kind of heartwarming story, so I do recommend it. Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. And finally, the 23rd book is The History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, another medieval text. It's an interesting and questionably accurate account of the kings of Britain, kings that are Britons, Britons, as opposed to the Picts, the Scots, the Saxons, the Irish, the Normans, and everyone else. I don't know, I just found it really interesting because supposedly the father of Britain and the father of the British race was this fellow named Brutus, who was a descendant of Aeneas of Troy, main character of the Aeneid. Yeah, this book also contains kind of the origins of the Arthur and Merlin legends. There's a whole section on King Arthur and his life, and he's this very Christian king who conquers like most of Europe. The characters Guinevere and Mordred feature, so do giants. Yeah, a lot of it is not very believable, to be honest. And so reading through this book is an exercise in testing the historical accuracy of things that Geoffrey says, such as the British supposedly sacked Rome a bunch of times. That never happened, but Geoffrey claims that they did. And so you're just like, which means that if you're a proper historian, you're gonna go and fact check, cross-reference everything that Geoffrey says, dig into the actual evidence, archaeological evidence, and evidence from other sources to kind of prove or disprove some of Geoffrey's claims. So yeah, if you read through this, take it with a grain of salt, but there are some really interesting ideas and characters in this book, and it gives you a fascinating look into the medieval mind. I don't have a ton more to say about this book because, yeah, it was good, but it wasn't my favorite. It didn't blow my mind or change my life. Yeah, so that's everything that I've read so far this year, besides, smaller bits and chunks of books here and there that I didn't include in this video. And I've got some really interesting reads on the go right now. I'm reading The Grapes of Wrath, The Fellowship of the Ring, Silmarillion still, a biography of Louisa May Alcott, Antony and Cleopatra, Macbeth, and I'm also reading my own book again, which is sort of painful, and I'm going to make a video on that experience, what it's like to literally pick up your own novel and read through it, and just all the mixed feelings and thoughts that you have when you do something like that, because there's some big feelings there, because there's a lot of history there. So yeah, that's where I'm at right now. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you've read any of these books or if you're planning to read any of these books. Yeah, I love to hear from you. I love to hear your thoughts. Please like this video. Please do comment. Please do subscribe. I really appreciate your support of my channel and of me. I love talking about books here, and sometimes it's hard to find the time to do so, but you guys make it worth it. When you let me know that you've enjoyed my videos or learned something, or when you recommend books to me and teach me things, that's just the best, and it makes it all worth it for me. So thank you so much again, and I hope you all have a lovely day, and I will see you again very soon.